Just over a century ago, in September 1920, a brand new state was carved out of the ashes of the Ottoman Empire, Greater Lebanon. Now, this wasn't some simple story of independence. No, this was a story born from absolute devastation, a clash of wildly different ambitions, and the raw power politics of a world being totally remade by war. To really get how Lebanon was even created, you've got to understand the sheer horror of what came right before it. When Allied forces finally arrived in 1918, they walked into a living nightmare. A French naval medic described streets just filled with emaciated people and carts loading corpses into mass graves. It was a humanitarian catastrophe on a scale that's, well, it's hard to even imagine. And that scale, it was just staggering. The Great War Famine, which was caused by a combination of an Allied naval blockade and Ottoman policies, killed about 1/3 of the entire population of Mount Lebanon. Think about that. 1/3. This was the absolutely shattered world from which a new nation was supposed to emerge. So how in the world do you get from that kind of devastation to a new country? Well, we're going to walk through it in 5 key stages. First, we'll look at the shattered land itself. Then, the conflicting dreams of the local communities. After that, the chess match being played by Britain and France. Then, the short, sharp war that changed everything. And finally, the actual birth of the state. All right, let's start with that shattered land. You see, when the Ottoman Empire, which had been around for 400 years, finally collapsed, it didn't just leave a power vacuum. It left a society that was on the absolute brink. The famine was, of course, the worst part, but believe me, it wasn't the only crisis. The region's main industry, silk production, had completely collapsed. The forests had been stripped bare for fuel. The Ottoman commander, a guy named Cemal Pasha, had brutally repressed any hint of Arab nationalism. And on top of all that, the land was just flooded with refugees and an estimated 20,000 orphans. This was ground zero. So, with the Ottomans gone, local communities finally had a chance to shape their own destiny. The problem? They all had completely different and totally conflicting ideas about what that destiny should look like. This table really breaks down the fundamental divisions. You had the Maronite Christians, who had long-standing ties to France, and they wanted an expanded Lebanese state, but under French protection. Then you had the Druze community, who were leaning towards a British mandate. And then many Muslims, both Sunni and Shia, were really drawn to the idea of pan-Arabism, this dream of a single, unified Arab nation, often called Greater Syria, which would include all the Lebanese territories. These weren't just minor disagreements. We're talking about fundamentally incompatible visions for the future. And right into this messy mix of local rivalries, in come the great powers. The fate of this region wasn't going to be decided in Beirut or Damascus. Nope. The real decisions were being made in London and Paris. This was a high-stakes game for control of the Middle East. You see, even before the war was over, Britain and France had already in secret drawn their own map. It was called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and it was basically a colonial blueprint that divided up the Ottoman lands into their own spheres of influence. And in that deal, France was promised Syria and Lebanon. This agreement, by the way, completely ignored any promises made to Arab leaders who had fought with the British against the Ottomans. And this slide just perfectly captures the diplomatic collision course they were on. On one side, you have the French foreign minister basically declaring France's incontestable rights to the region. But on the other, you have Prince Faisal, the leader of the Arab revolt, arguing for a unified Arab nation that would absolutely include Lebanon. There was just no middle ground here. For a hot minute, it actually looked like diplomacy might work. In late 1919, there was an agreement floated that maybe, just maybe, could have worked. But by March 1920, the Syrian National Congress took matters into its own hands. They just unilaterally declared a fully independent kingdom of Syria. And yes, that included Lebanon. For France, this was a direct challenge, and their response was going to be swift, and it was going to be military. With diplomacy in tatters, France decided to just impose its will by force. That long-held French dream of controlling Syria and Lebanon, well, now it was going to be realized through conquest. The whole thing came to a head in July 1920 at the Battle of Maysalun. The brand new and frankly overmatched Arab army of the Kingdom of Syria was just crushed by professional French troops. Faisal was forced into exile, the pan-Arab dream for Syria was over, and the final obstacle to France's plan was just gone. So with total military control, France could now redraw the map of the region exactly as it wished. No negotiation, no compromise. And here's exactly how they did it. First, to weaken any sense of Arab nationalism, they shattered the idea of a unified Syria, breaking it up into 4 smaller states. Second, they took the historical core of Mount Lebanon and expanded it, adding the coastal cities of Beirut, Tripoli, and Sudan, plus the super fertile Bekaa Valley. And finally, on September 1st, 1920, French General Gouraud stood in Beirut and officially proclaimed the new state of Greater Lebanon. So this new entity, the État du Grand Liban, was based on borders that had been lobbied for by Maronite delegations and drawn from an old French military map from the 1860s. It was designed to be economically viable and, crucially, to secure a state for France's Christian allies in the region. But, and this is a huge but, this act of creation came with a fateful legacy. By annexing heavily Muslim areas to the historically Christian Mount Lebanon, France created a state with a near-permanent demographic and sectarian fault line baked right in. As historian Martin Sicker points out, this decision essentially planted the seeds for the devastating civil war of 1975 and the many conflicts that would haunt Lebanon for the next century. And that leaves us with the central question of Lebanon's identity. Was it the fulfillment of a long-held local dream of independence, one that was championed by its Maronite community? Or was it, at the end of the day, an artificial creation, a colonial design imposed by a foreign power to serve its own interests? The answer, much like Lebanon itself, remains profoundly complex.